This is my first devlog for MUCOSITY Reign of the Molds, an FPS game I've been making in the Godot Game Engine for the better part of a year now. The reason I've chosen this point to start making devlogs is because I've recently heavily reworked the structure of the entire game. This seemed like a good opportunity to start making devlogs since I've begun to practically turn the project into a different game entirely. This first devlog gives a brief look at the development history of the game, how my mistake of oversized project scope caused the development to collapse, and my recent first steps to move forward with it by making major changes. I started development of the game around a year ago. When I first began to work on the project, I didn't really have any idea of what I wanted to aim for with the final game. Mainly, I was just interested in trying to create things that I haven't made before in my previous projects. One of the new things I tried was to make most of the assets from scratch, since I mainly used pre-made assets in my previous games. This would end up being one of the most successful decisions I've made for the project, but also one of the most disastrous. One of the easiest mistakes to make in indie game development, especially if you don't have a team, is to get overly excited about your game and rapidly increase the scope of the project, eventually reaching an extent that you won't be able to finish it in any reasonable amount of time. After planning to add more and more things each month, that's exactly what ended up happening. I had an unfeasible amount of work queued for myself if I were to continue making the game as planned. Eventually, it became clear to me that the goal I had set for myself was unfeasible for one person to finish in any reasonable amount of time. I ended up taking a break from working on the game for the better part of 2 months. After coming back from the break, I decided I needed to make some major changes to the game if I wanted any hope of ever completing it. Starting off, I tried to find things to cut that I felt weren't as high quality as I wanted. One of the things I decided to cut were my human character models. I felt like they didn't turn out very well relative to the amount of work I put into them. They didn't look as good as I had hoped, and their animation system was very buggy and not that polished. I decided that I'll replace them with 2D sprites that always face the camera. In theory, this should be much easier to work with. Around when I was first trying to figure out how to implement characters with 2D assets, I decided to scrap the text box-based dialogue system that I had made for the game, and replace it with recorded voice lines. For it to be clear which character was speaking at any given time, I needed some kind of lip sync for speaking NPCs. I created this scene to test different ways to make characters speak, with their mouths syncing to voice lines.
It appears you've stepped into my trap. Now I have to kill you.
Voice line test, motherfucker.
I was quite satisfied with the mouth sync methods I tried. The art style that I used with this flesh creature in the test scene would end up being the one I decided to go with for characters in the game. The next thing I looked into was how gameplay felt quite repetitive due to the game's small pool of weapons. They didn't really change much as you collected upgrades, so I ended up scrapping the upgrade system entirely, and in its place added a proper inventory system. At the time, all of the game's weapons were hard-coded in the player script. This was not a good practice for implementing this system, so I had to rewrite it to make it more scalable. All of the previously hard-coded weapons became items, integrated with the game's inventory system. This makes it much easier to add new weapons. The amount of work that went into creating my weapon sprites wouldn't scale very well, and given my recent changes, wouldn't really match the new art direction. I decided to make view sprites by drawing over reference photos going forward. With this workflow, I start off by taking some crude reference photos with random household objects and make the background transparent. Then I add them to the game. If it looks odd, I adjust the images. Once I'm satisfied with the weapon animations and positioning, then all I should have to do is draw the proper sprites over my reference images. After creating a bunch of new weapons, I began to think of how the game's progression system should work. I decided that in order to get better weapons, you could obtain them by bringing crafting ingredients to a blacksmith NPC. So I added a crafting recipe system and began to work on adding the blacksmith NPC. Blacksmith would of course be my first proper attempt to use the visual style for characters that I had decided on. The idea I went with was that there's a giant anvil object that you can interact with to get the blacksmith to appear. The blacksmith design I made was this guy, who had the word blacksmith tattooed around his hairline. His long neck stretches out from behind the anvil, accompanied by a cartoon slide whistle sound. I recorded some voice lines for him and added a music track.
Looking to get something put together with all the materials you've been gathering? See you later, alligator.
This ended up being the result. Gameplay additions aside, I've also added a few tools to make testing the game easier, such as a Gmod-like spawn menu for testing NPCs and objects. I also added a menu that lets you quickly load any map in the game. Overall, I'm quite satisfied with this new direction. The more varied gameplay feels more fun and way less repetitive. And I feel like this new goofier style gives the game more personality. So that concludes this first devlog. As I make more changes and additions to the game, I'll make a second devlog. If people find these videos interesting, I may continue to make devlogs throughout the game's development. If you have any thoughts, I'd love to hear them in the comments. Until next time.